The frequency is silent, but the physics of the collapse are already in motion, vibrating through the infrastructure of every major city before the first siren even sounds. We have been conditioned to believe that the end of the world is a sudden, explosive event, a cinematic flash of light followed by immediate chaos. Yet the hidden science of systemic failure suggests a far more insidious and quiet erosion of the physical laws that hold our civilization together. When the grid fails, it isn't just the lights going out. It is the instantaneous cessation of the thermal dynamics required to keep 300 million people from succumbing to the environment within 72 hours. The government's public service announcements focus on stockpiling canned goods and flashlights, a superficial band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound, because the true mechanics of a total blackout involve the rapid desynchronization of the North American power grid, an event so complex and physically violent that it could take years, not weeks, to repair. You are told to wait for instructions that will never arrive because the very medium of that instruction, the electromagnetic spectrum, will be the first theater of the conflict. The misunderstanding lies in our reliance on just-in-time logistics, a mathematical efficiency model that assumes a frictionless environment where resources flow without interruption. But when the friction of a real-world catastrophe is applied, this system doesn't just slow down. It shatters. The hidden science of survival is not found in a gear catalog, but in the understanding of entropy and the fragile thermal envelopes we inhabit, where the difference between a survivor and a statistic is the ability to manipulate the laws of thermodynamics when the industrial buffer is stripped away. The primary danger begins with the invisible decay of the electromagnetic spectrum, a phenomenon that occurs long before the physical riots or the grocery store brawls. In a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse or a severe geomagnetic storm, the interaction between ionized particles and the Earth's magnetic field creates a localized surge that induces current in every conductive material on the surface, essentially turning our entire electrical infrastructure into a massive antenna for its own destruction. While the public is told to worry about their smartphones, the real threat is the massive, custom-built high-voltage transformers that regulate the flow of energy across the continent. These units are not mass-produced. They are bespoke pieces of engineering that take months, sometimes years, to manufacture and transport. If 10% of these units are compromised simultaneously, the grid enters a state of permanent black start failure, where there is no longer enough residual energy to kickstart the system back into life. This is the hidden science your government understands but cannot solve. The vulnerability of the extra high voltage backbone. When this fails, the cascading effect is immediate. Without electricity, the pumps that maintain pressure in our water mains cease to function, and the gravity-fed systems that remain will be depleted within hours. The misunderstanding of the average citizen is that they have a few days to prepare, but the chemical reality of water treatment means that without constant automated dosing of chlorine and coagulants, the water in the pipes becomes a stagnant breeding ground for pathogens almost instantly. Evidence of this systemic fragility can be found in every major blackout of the last 20 years, where localized failures nearly spiraled into regional collapses due to the inability of automated relays to handle the rapid phase shifts in the current. In a true shtf scenario, we are looking at a total loss of the cold chain, the refrigerated logistics network that keeps 90% of our caloric intake from rotting. Within 48 hours, the heat of metabolic decay begins to transform every supermarket in the country into a biohazard. The survival implications are staggering. You are not just losing power, you are losing the ability to preserve energy in its most vital form, food. The government hides the severity of this because there is no civilian solution for the loss of the cold chain on a national scale. Your survival depends on your ability to transition from a consumer of industrial calories to a master of biological preservation. You must understand the science of fermentation, dehydration, and salt curing, not as hobbies, but as the only methods of arresting the entropic decay of organic matter. The escalation of the crisis moves from the electrical to the biological with terrifying speed, as the lack of waste management systems leads to a resurgence of 19th century diseases like cholera and dysentery in modern urban centers. The transition from a modern citizen to a primitive survivor happens at the speed of a braking circuit, and if you are not already mentally operating in the world that exists after the lights, you are already behind the curve of the catastrophe. The hidden science of thermal regulation is the next layer of the survival reality that is often ignored in favor of tactical gear and weaponry. Humans are remarkably fragile biological engines that require a very narrow internal temperature range to maintain cellular function. In a grid-down winter scenario, the phenomenon of thermal bridging becomes your greatest enemy, as the very materials used to build modern homes, steel, aluminum, and even certain types of glass, act as heat sinks that strip the warmth from your body and radiate it into the void. The government's advice to huddle together is a pathetic simplification of the complex physics of radiant heat transfer and convective cooling. To survive, you must understand the microclimate strategy, which involves creating nested layers of insulation that minimize the volume of air your body has to heat. This is the science of the room within a room. By isolating a single small space and sealing it with vapor barriers to prevent the loss of latent heat through humidity exchange, you can maintain life-sustaining temperatures even when the external environment is sub-zero. The misunderstanding here is that a fireplace or a wood stove is enough. The reality is that without the knowledge of air exchange rates and carbon monoxide accumulation, many will succumb to the very heat sources they rely on. The hidden science of air density and gas stratification means that in a sealed survival environment, the air you breathe can become toxic long before it becomes cold. The escalation continues into the realm of human psychology and the breakdown of the social contract, which is not a philosophical concept, but a biological one based on the availability of surplus energy. When the surplus energy of the grid is removed, the biological cost of cooperation becomes higher than the cost of competition. This is the caloric math of the apocalypse. If it takes 500 calories of effort to cooperate with a neighbor, but only 200 to take what they have, the mathematical inevitability of violence becomes clear. This is the dark truth the government hides behind the veneer of community resilience programs. True survival requires an analytical approach to human interaction, treating every encounter as a high-stakes calculation of resource expenditure and risk mitigation. You must learn to read the physiological signs of caloric deficit and dehydration in others, as these biological stressors will trigger the reptilian brain, overriding the prefrontal cortex and making rational negotiation impossible. The evidence of this is seen in every famine and siege in human history, where the thin layer of civilization is stripped away to reveal the raw, predatory nature of the species. Survival in this environment is not about being the strongest. It is about being the most invisible and the most efficient in your use of force and resources. We are moving into a phase where the transition is no longer about the environment, but about the social structure itself, as it deforms and reforms into tribal units based on immediate proximity and shared desperation. The transition from a cooperative society to a predatory landscape is governed by the laws of behavioral ecology, specifically the marginal value theorem, which dictates how organisms forage and compete when resources become patchily distributed. In a grid-down scenario, the urban environment becomes a series of high-risk, low-reward patches, where the energy cost of movement often exceeds the caloric value of the scavenged goods. The government hides the statistical certainty of urban entrapment, the reality that once the logistical flow of fuel and food stops, the city becomes a thermodynamic cage. The hidden science of caloric density versus weight becomes the most critical equation in your existence. You are told to pack emergency rations, but the reality is that most commercially available survival foods are nutritionally incomplete for the high-intensity physical labor required in a post-collapse world. The misunderstanding of the average prepper is the reliance on high-carbohydrate, low-fat diets that lead to rapid insulin spikes and subsequent crashes, leaving the survivor physically exhausted and mentally clouded at the exact moment a tactical decision must be made. True survival science points toward a ketogenic transition where the body is primed to utilize stored adipose tissue and high-density lipids, allowing for sustained exertion and cognitive clarity without a constant external fuel source. This is a physiological adaptation that must be initiated before the crisis, not during the acute phase of starvation. As the escalation moves into the second and third weeks of a total blackout, the hidden science of signal discipline becomes a matter of life and death. While the public is often told to use flares or mirrors to signal for rescue, the reality of a long-term shtf event is that any signal you send is more likely to attract a predator than a savior. The electromagnetic spectrum, though largely silent, still carries the electronic signatures of those using unshielded devices. The government possesses and has deployed in various theaters SIGINT, signal intelligence tools, that can triangulate a low-power radio transmission or even the stray electromagnetic interference from a poorly shielded laptop or solar inverter within seconds. In a truly collapsed state, these tools may fall into the hands of organized paramilitary groups or rogue elements. The forbidden science of RF obscuration involves understanding how to use the landscape, specifically the knife-edge diffraction of hills and the attenuation properties of dense vegetation, to mask your transmissions. You must learn to treat your communications like a sniper treats a shot. One brief, concentrated burst of data, followed by immediate relocation. The misunderstanding here is the belief that encrypted means invisible. Encryption only hides the content. The metadata of the signal itself, its location, duration, and frequency, is a glowing beacon in a dark forest. The evidence of this can be seen in modern asymmetric warfare, where the most advanced insurgents are not those with the best guns, but those who have mastered the art of spectrum silence. This brings us to the survival implications of the silent grid. When the internet fails, the average person loses 90% of their actionable knowledge. The hidden science of analog data redundancy is the only protection against this cognitive collapse. You must possess physical, paper-based records of engineering, chemistry, and medicine, specifically focusing on pre-industrial methods that can be replicated with scavenged materials. The government's reliance on digital infrastructure means that in a true blackout, even their own field manuals may become inaccessible to the personnel on the ground. The escalation of the crisis will see a rapid technological regression where the ability to manufacture simple black powder, distill high-purity ethanol for antiseptic use, and construct basic Faraday cages will separate the new elite from the masses. The transition is not just physical. It is an intellectual pivot from being a user of technology to being a master of the principles that underlie it. This leads directly into the analysis of fluid dynamics in a collapsed urban environment. Most people view a city as a static collection of buildings, but in a crisis, it becomes a fluid system of bottlenecks and flow paths. The theory of constraints suggests that in any evacuation, the movement of the whole is dictated by the narrowest point of the exit. The government hides the fact that their evacuation routes are mathematically designed to be sacrificial zones, areas where the population is concentrated to keep them away from vital military and administrative corridors. The survival science of vector-based egress involves moving against the flow of the panicked mass, utilizing secondary and tertiary infrastructure like rail corridors, utility easements, and even subterranean drainage systems that remain unmapped by the general public. The misunderstanding is that a vehicle is your best chance of escape. The reality is that a vehicle is a 2-ton metal anchor that will trap you in a kill zone of stalled traffic. True tactical readiness requires the ability to move 20 miles a day on foot with a 40-pound load, navigating via terrain association rather than GPS, which can be easily spoofed or shut down by the Department of Defense using selective availability protocols. The escalation of the biological threat now takes a turn toward the microbial frontier. As the waste management and water treatment systems remain dormant, the very soil in urban and suburban areas becomes a vector for tetanus, hookworm, and various enteric pathogens. The hidden science of sanitation zoning is what will save a camp from being wiped out by a single case of infection. You must understand the 3-zone system: the sterile zone for food and medical prep, the transition zone for hygiene, and the septic zone for waste. The government's failure to emphasize this in their public materials is a catastrophic oversight, as more people historically die from poor sanitation in a collapse than from violence or starvation. The survival implications are clear. You must become your own epidemiologist, monitoring the health of your group with the same intensity that you monitor your perimeter. The transition to a closed-loop biological system, where every gram of waste is managed and every drop of water is triple filtered and UV treated, is the only way to endure the long-term degradation of the environment. The hidden science of survival is a relentless analytical battle against the rising tide of chaos and entropy that follows the loss of the grid. The escalation now reaches the stage of resource scarcity kinetics, where the primary threat is no longer the initial shock, but the secondary and tertiary depletion of the environment. The hidden science of scavenging physics dictates that in a post-grid world, the most valuable assets are not those that provide immediate utility, but those that allow for the conversion of waste into energy. The government hides the reality that the petroleum in your vehicle's tank and the backup generators at the local hospital has a chemical shelf life. Due to the phase separation of ethanol-blended fuels and the oxidative instability of diesel, the world's fuel supply will begin to degrade into a useless, gummy varnish within 6 to 12 months. The misunderstanding of the average prepper is the belief that they can simply siphon gas forever. The reality is that without the science of fuel stabilization and the knowledge of how to modify internal combustion engines to run on wood gas or pure ethanol, you will be left with a graveyard of high-tech machinery. The forbidden science of gasification, using a restricted oxygen fire to turn wood into a combustible gas, is an engineering principle that was used during World War II to keep entire economies moving. Yet it is absent from modern emergency analysis of the atmospheric shift reveals another hidden layer of danger: the loss of the urban heat island effect. In a total blackout, cities that were once artificially warmed by millions of idling engines and heating systems will experience a rapid thermal collapse, with ambient temperatures dropping significantly lower than they did during the pre-collapse era. This creates a lethal feedback loop for those trapped in high-rise structures where the stack effect pulls freezing air up through elevator shafts and stairwells. The survival implications require a deep understanding of passive solar gain and the thermal mass of materials. To survive, you must abandon the upper floors and move to the thermal core of a structure, utilizing the Earth's constant subterranean temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit if possible. The government's silence on this transition is a byproduct of their focus on orderly sheltering, which assumes a level of structural insulation that simply does not exist without active HVAC systems. Evidence of the next phase, the nutritional cliff, is found in the metabolic breakdown of the human body under sustained stress. Most survivalists focus on calories, but the hidden science of micronutrient lockout is what actually kills. Without vitamin C, scurvy begins to manifest in as little as 60 days. Without vitamin B1, thiamine, the nervous system begins to fail, leading to Wernicke-Korsakoff symptoms that mimic dementia. The misunderstanding is that food is food, but the reality is that a diet of stored white rice and beans is a slow-motion death sentence for the brain's cognitive functions. You must understand the bioavailability of local flora, the forbidden knowledge of emergency foraging that focuses on high-nutrient weeds like stinging nettle, dandelion, and pine needle tea, which provide the essential enzymatic precursors to keep your immune system from collapsing. The transition from a store-bought diet to a wild harvested one is a chemical gauntlet that requires precise knowledge of phytochemistry to avoid the toxic alkaloids that many plants produce as a defense mechanism. The escalation moves into the tactical acoustics of a silent world. In a grid-down scenario, the ambient noise floor of a city drops from 70 decibels to near zero, meaning a human voice or the metallic click of a rifle safety can be heard for miles. The government's tactical manuals for urban combat are built around the assumption of noise masking from traffic and machinery. Without it, you are operating in a sonic fishbowl. The hidden science of sound attenuation involves using the acoustic shadow created by terrain and building geometry to move without being detected. The survival implication is that your primary defense is no longer a wall, but acoustic camouflage. You must learn to synchronize your movements with natural sounds, the wind, the rain, or the movement of animals, to mask the rhythmic signature of human activity. The misunderstanding that silence is safety is a fatal error. In the post-collapse world, silence is a medium through which your presence is broadcast to every predator within a 5-mile radius. The escalation of the sonic fishbowl leads directly into the hidden science of atmospheric refraction and its impact on long-range surveillance. In a world without the haze of industrial particulate matter and the light pollution of the metropolitan grid, the visual and auditory horizon expands significantly. The government understands, but does not publicize, that the optical clarity of a post-collapse atmosphere allows for thermal signatures to be detected at nearly double their normal range. The misunderstanding of the average survivor is the belief that darkness is a cloak. The reality is that the human body, radiating at approximately 37 degrees Celsius, becomes a high-contrast beacon against the rapidly cooling background of a dead city. The forbidden science of thermal masking involves more than just a space blanket, which actually creates a cold hole in the thermal spectrum that is just as conspicuous as a heat source. True tactical survival requires the use of convective venting and diurnal heat loading, where you utilize the thermal mass of stone walls or dense earth to absorb and dissipate your body heat into the ground. This brings us to the analysis of the chemical decay of the medicine cabinet. The government's strategic national stockpile is a closely guarded secret, not just because of its contents, but because of the science of molecular degradation they don't want you to know. While most oral solid medications, like common antibiotics, retain a significant percentage of their potency for years past their expiration date if kept in a controlled environment, the liquid phase medications and biologics like insulin or epinephrine undergo a rapid, irreversible chemical breakdown the moment the cold chain is severed. The survival implications are brutal. Those dependent on synthesized hormones or complex biologics are living on a countdown dictated by the laws of organic chemistry. To survive, you must look toward the hidden science of pharmacognosy, the study of medicinal drugs derived from plants and other natural sources. Understanding the salicylate content of willow bark or the juglone properties of black walnut isn't just folk medicine, it is the application of biochemistry to replace an industrial pharmaceutical supply chain that no longer exists. The evidence of the final escalation is found in the hydraulic failure of the soil. Without the constant maintenance of drainage culverts, pumps, and levees, the geography of our living spaces will fundamentally shift. The hidden science of geomorphology suggests that many suburban developments are built on reclaimed wetlands that will return to their natural state within 24 months of a power failure. The government hides the maps of these inundation zones to prevent property devaluation, but in a grid-down scenario, these areas will become impassable bogs, cutting off escape routes and drowning stored caches. The misunderstanding is that high ground is always safe. The reality is that the stability of the slope is dependent on the water table. As the infrastructure for managing runoff fails, landslips and soil liquefaction will become the new silent killers of the rural prepper. The transition to the deep survival phase requires a total abandonment of the resilience myth. The government promotes the idea that we can bounce back to the previous state, but the science of hysteresis in complex systems proves that once a system passes a certain tipping point, it cannot return to its original configuration even if the stressors are removed. We are not waiting for a return to normal. We are witness to the birth of a new, harsher equilibrium. The final transmission is not a call for help, but a data dump of the physical laws that will govern your new life. You must become a systemic auditor, constantly evaluating the flow of energy, water, and risk through your immediate environment. The hidden truth is that the government cannot save you because the government is a creature of the grid, and when the grid dies, the creature dies with it. Your survival is predicated on your ability to transcend the artificial safety of the 21st century and master the raw, uncompromising emergency science of the end of the world.